Okay, in the second of today's lectures, I explore that most necessary of articles for the security and comfort of life in a cold and wet climate: fuel. Energy is one of the most contentious dimensions of contemporary environmental debates, particularly where it is obtained through the combustion of fossil fuels or other carbon-releasing materials. Most of us today obtain our energy for heating and light at the flick of a switch, with little thought as to how it was generated. But for our ancestors, unless they were members of the privileged few who commanded the labour of others, their annual fuel needs were met through their personal effort. What fuel they chose was dependent on multiple variables, some of which were climatic in origin, others more dependent on anthropogenic factors. Although coal has a powerful hold in the popular imagination as Scotland's historic fuel of choice, and was certainly prevalent since the 16th century in boroughs around the Firth of Forth, it was beyond the physical and financial reach of most Scots, even in areas close to mines, even after 1850. Instead, it was the one fuel that is still present across large parts of Scotland's upland and lowland zones, peat, that dominated as the source of thermal energy. Denigrated since the 18th century as the fuel of the ignorant and culturally inferior, i.e. Scots and Irish, peat was the primary fuel of most Scots into the 1840s, and for many even into the 1960s. Travelling anywhere in Scotland today outside the urbanised or arable districts, peat seems ubiquitous. Yet, even by 1200, demand exceeded supply in mosses close to major settlements, forcing changes in management regimes and, where source became exhausted, driving transitions to alternatives that were not necessarily as thermally efficient or easily gathered. The degraded land legacies of peat extraction might be less visible today than legacies of coal and shale extraction. But the ecologically stunted expanses of peat strip devastation in the so-called flayed or skinned lands, or Geri in some Gaelic-speaking districts, are stark reminders of the long, slow violence of peat extraction. These are zones where all peat was removed, leaving the stony foot of the moss at its interface with the mineralised subsoil, but more often in areas of the greatest peat hunger with no peaty material left at all. The subsoil, often boulder-strewn glacial drifts, was left exposed and eroding. Some such areas saw attempted cultivation, but elsewhere they remain a visible reminder of past human demand for thermal energy and the precariousness of access to adequate supplies. Without ready access to fuel, even otherwise resilient communities will fail. Energy crisis and fuel poverty seem very modern concepts, but perceptions of a peat crisis affected individuals and communities from the early 1500s and provoked legal challenges, fuel raids, and physical violence. Let us start near the end of today's story in 1786. Then, in the aftermath of one of the coldest episodes of the Little Ice Age, the tenants of Middle Licks in Glendochart complained to their lord, the Earl of Breadalbane, that the men of nearby Killin were cutting peat in the Licks mosses. They petitioned for the Killin men to be given the hill of Straw na Clachan, where there was, claimed the Licks folk, an inexhaustible supply. Despite the increasing exploitation of Scotland's mainly inland and upland mosses, the surviving expanses of peatland wood, prima facie, seem to bear out such claims. Indeed, much of the published historical research into the nature of the early modern Scottish economy assumes that fuel was one commodity to exist both in abundance and relatively easy access. The Licks men's words ring hollow, however, their complaint carrying an undertone of fear that allowing Killin access to their moss would put Licks' supply into jeopardy. The encroachment by the Killin folk, coupled with the efforts from Middle Licks to preserve exclusive rights, perhaps indicates that there was awareness that accessible mosses locally were anything but inexhaustible. In the event, an alternative supply was given to Killin in 1792, but lasted barely 70 years before it too was exhausted. Having stripped Straw na Clachan, the voracious Killin folk simply sought Breadalbane's permission to cut at another source. In the early 20th century, the negative impact of peat extraction was seen by government as a problem in the Highlands and Islands and a barrier to investment and economic development. The peat denuded ground exposed once all usable fuel had been removed was seen as a sterile desert, incapable of cultivation. It has not been widely recognised, however, that through many parts of northeast, lowland and southern upland Scotland, the modern landscape is likewise an artefact of peat cutting over millennia. While extensive mosses remain in there, documentary sources show that by the late 1600s, peat was rising in value and subject to litigation over access to or possession of reserves. These trends suggest that demand for a once plentiful resource was, after centuries of exploitation, outstripping supplies. Paleoenvironmental studies, like that conducted on Brisbane Mire outside Whithorn in Galloway, reinforces evidence for over-exploitation and supply crisis in the documentary record. At Brisbane, where cutting began on a substantial scale only in 1763, sampling has revealed that the remaining peat was a compressed late Holocene sequence on top of late glacial and early mid-Holocene growth. Cutting had removed almost the entire peat accumulation over the intervening centuries within 50 to 100 years at most, with the top layers representing new growth since its abandonment in the 19th century. Such a scale of impact can be identified at other locations distributed widely around the country. Although archaeological evidence shows that peat was consumed in late prehistoric Scotland, firm documentary evidence for its exploitation as fuel survives only from the 1120s. Down to about 1150, grants of fuel rights indicate that wood was the preferred source of thermal energy in lowland areas, and that peat was used when wood supplies fell short. In the Northern Isles, Hebrides, and much of North Mainland Scotland, where woodland had largely gone by about 1500 BCE, peat was the only viable fuel type. In parts of Scotland, principally around the Firth of Forth and in central Ayrshire, coal was mined before 1200 rather. Comparatively poor internal communication networks and the apparent abundance of alternative fuels in places remote from coal-producing districts, however, ensured that throughout the Middle Ages, coal use occurred only close to mines. According to the mythic information in the 13th century Orkney Inga saga, is a claim that the possibly fictitious late 9th century Jarl Torf Einar was the first man to dig for fuel, firewood being very scarce on the islands at Tarbetness in Scotland. End quote. The fictive aspect of this information about peat use is well understood, but it allows us to corroborate two things. First, that having adopted peat cutting from their indigenous predecessors, the primary fuel used by the Norse in Orkney down to the 10th century was peat. Secondly, that after millennia of use by Orkney's pre-Norse inhabitants and their Scandinavian successors, convenient sources of good quality peat was scarce already in areas of heaviest Norse settlement in the islands. Orkney Inga Saga's 13th century reflection on the scarcity of woodland also suggests that little had changed from the late antique Little Ice Age, 6th and 7th century position of surviving patches of scrubby woodland in an otherwise open landscape. This absence of woodland from the Northern Isles and a growing difficulty to source peat in some areas, however, meant that remaining scrubwood was used for structural needs, as were the large driftwood timber from island beaches. At Poole, the shortage of other thermal energy sources meant that dried seaweed probably served as fuel for most domestic needs, with peat, wood and charcoal mixes reserved for specialist functions that required high temperatures. During the early stages of the Norse settlement in the late 8th, early 9th century to mid-10th centuries, the occupants of Poole still burned small quantities of willow, alder and birch, but the bulk fuels included straw, dung and seaweed. Clearly, there had been no regeneration of woodland. Despite evidence for lowland difficulties in sourcing wood in the latter stages of the medieval climate anomaly, Scottish historians and archaeologists have rarely discussed fuel supply. When transitions between dominant fuel types occurred, they are seen usually as smooth, technologically driven processes arising from conscious choices rather than adopted by necessity. But I have argued that change was supply-fed and led, especially in proto-industrial processes like salt manufacture. We can see that transition occurred in waves from the 12th to 19th century, depending on location and population density. Early 12th century record evidence survives for peat use in areas where woodland was scarce, as in the late 1120s grant to Kelso Abbey of rights to peat and turf on Ednam Moor for, quote, making fire, end quote. Elsewhere, a transition episode from scarce firewood to cheaper, more widely available peat is evident circa 1175 and affected urban and rural populations alike. Ready access to alternatives eased that transition, but cultural accommodation and environmental change were key underlying factors. For rural populations, mixes of fuel of varying compositions dependent on local availability had been the norm for centuries. Deadwood gleaning or windfall from woodland, heather and scrub species like broom, gorse or whin, dried seaweed, peat and dried animal dung were the main thermal energy sources, with fuelwood supplies being maintained through natural regeneration and the coppicing I discussed earlier today. As illustrated by Humphrey de Barclay's grant of land in the Mearns to Arbroath Abbey, wood easements were accompanied by access to peateries. Here, fuelwood was reserved for uses that did not require the heat of high calorific charcoal or the best quality peat. For the inhabitants of boroughs and monasteries, many of whom were colonists from regions where wood was the sole fuel type, anything else was culturally alien. All the first townsfolk gained shares of arable and pastoral resources in the borough's common lands for production of their dietary staples, and all had equal shares in building materials and fuel resources from those lands, with which to erect and heat their homes, cook and provide fires for craft purposes. Pollen evidence suggests, however, that the hinterlands of the new settlements were already largely treeless before circa 1100. Evidence for rising demand and diminishing local availability is clear here in Edinburgh. Woodland was already scarce locally before its foundation as a borough in the reign of David I, as illustrated between 1128 and 1150 in his charter to Holyrood Abbey, which spoke solely of wood or brushwood for fuel. The same charter forbade neighbouring rural communities from cutting peat in lands granted to Holyrood, although peat was not listed amongst the Abbey's resources. This omission implies that wood resources locally were already challenged, and Holyrood's rights in the woods required explicit definition to ensure they were enforceable, whereas peat did not. Further charters show that around Edinburgh, woods disappeared rapidly, underscoring the circumstances which required explicit reservation of the resource. By 1150, peat was already the most common fuel named in Edinburgh records, with few later grants mentioning firewood. Before 1200, the borough was a peat-burning town, and the wetlands which extended west from Edinburgh past Carstorphon and on west towards Gogar provided most of its fuel needs throughout the 13th century. As Edinburgh grew and its mossland became located further and further from the urban area proper, richer townsfolk sought alternative and more convenient fuel to burn. In contrast to wood, peat seemed abundant and was indeed seen as inexhaustible due to its ubiquity and unmeasured depth. Boroughs were able at first to supplement the materials necessary to meet their fuel needs from mosses on their common land, with managed brushwood areas still providing fuelwood and coppice-yielding charcoal for specialist craft purposes. But limitless bounty it was not. Stricter enforcement of exclusive peat-cutting rights came in the later 1100s as firewood pressures mounted, and what many townsfolk had once regarded as a culturally inferior fuel became the only affordable option. The shift emerges clearest in records relating to industrial processes, which use high volumes of fuel like hornworking, cloth dyeing, and salt production, which at this date involved the boiling of sleeched brine. And sorry about the quality of this historic England picture. Earlier 12th century grants of salt pans had included rights to firewood, but from the 1170s onwards, the fuel rights granted were exclusively peat. At Altons, on the coast south of Aberdeen, for example, Cooper Angus Abbey acquired a salt pan in the early 1230s with access, quote, to a sufficient peatery for the making of salt, end quote. Aided by the warmer and drier conditions of the MCA, which increased the likelihood of securing an adequate supply of cut peat in May and its drying by September for burning over the next 12-month cycle, the dependability of a fuel type whose main limitation was in terms of the volume that could be cut with the available labour ensured its widespread adoption. Whatever Burgess's cultural perception of peat's inferiority, its higher calorific value and greater thermal efficiency relative to volume over wood, coupled with its greater and easier accessibility, saw its adoption as the fuel of choice. We should not underestimate the significance of this transition or its environmental legacies. As conflict over control of peat sources through the Little Ice Age illustrate, voracious consumption of this fuel by both urban and rural populations led to a future shortage as accessible areas were stripped. The later 18th century removal of the raised peat bog at Flanders Moss in the span of a few decades is often cited as a classic example of the destruction of a wetland. But while clearance of peat for fuel in places like the Moss of Blair between Cooper Angus and Blair Gowrie took centuries, it saw identical peat stripping that exposed the boulder clays and gravels beneath them and their subsequent exploitation as arable land. As much as woodland clearance did, the inroads on Scotland's lowland mosses delivered profound transformation, removing environmental zones with complex ecologies that had satisfied other resource needs. As the moss contracted, so did supplies of smallwood from the scrub supported on the peat, and cattle grazing on the poor grass and richer scrubland vert. Seasonal exploitation for materials needs and hunting declined as the mossland shrank, scrub disappeared, and the small game and wildfowl were driven elsewhere. How did changing climate affect supply and demand for peat? After provision of dietary staples and expenditure of labour on cultivation, the greatest outlay of human effort by our ancestors was focused on securing fuel for heat, light and cooking. Against a backdrop of colder conditions, it would be unsurprising to find that consumption of fuel across all social classes increased. Domestic consumption, however, was only part of the equation, for environmental givens of an earlier age, such as expectation that crops would be harvested fully ripe and dry, could no longer be taken for granted. Securing volumes of basic foodstuffs adequate to subsist across the following year required maximisation of the grain yield, regardless of quality or condition. Cereal types that were more dependent on higher temperature and moderate rainfall, like wheat, were planted less. And there was a trend instead towards a greater dependency on cold and wet-tolerant varieties of oats. If unripe and wet, all grains required drying to prevent them from rotting, becoming fungus-infested or germinating, and to render them capable of being milled. Such things as corn drying kilns, therefore, and the need for greater expenditure of thermal energy in the colder, damper conditions of the 15th century, added to pressures on sources of adequate fuel. We see responses to those pressures, however, only in the closing decades of the 15th century, when scattered references to conflict over peat proliferate. In the 16th century, those scattered references coalesce and expose an all-pervading perception of a widespread supply problem. As with yesterday's language of harvest failures and famine, it is going too far to describe as a crisis something that unfolded over several centuries. Nevertheless, the provision of one of the fundamentals of daily living was an issue that affected the everyday lives of most Scots at a most basic level. We need, however, to distinguish between two separate problems. First, there was a long history of perceived shortage of fuel, mainly close to the long-established population centres with high consumption. The issue here is ease of access rather than shortage. Second, both in such areas and where fuel supplies remained abundant, poor weather made the securing of adequate quantities of certain fuel types more difficult. Imagine drying cattle dung in the rain. Just as we must temper our view of harvest failures to recognise that food supply for many Scots was precarious in most years, so we should recognise that securing ample fuels to cook, heat homes, or process materials was a perennial struggle that was marginally better or worse in any given year. It was not necessarily the case that there was no fuel to be had. In comparison to many parts of Europe, so much of Scotland was energy rich. But that increasingly supply sources lay distant from the centres of consumption or were in a condition that made it difficult to use. Added to this was an inhibitor to the development of a commercial trade in fuel between supply-rich and demand-heavy areas, in that most rural peasant and lower-status urban households still met their own annual fuel needs through the expenditure of their personal labour. In that sense, fuel was free, but the labour cost of winning it was high, and increasingly so when weather deteriorated. For urban elites and the upper ranks of society generally, however, there was a shift towards satisfying their fuel needs through market supply, which in time stimulated the introduction of and growing demand for alternative types of fuel, coal especially. From our climate records, the first change that had an adverse impact on households was that it was colder and remained so for longer in most years. There were short periods of intensely cold winters and delayed springs, followed by cooler and wetter summers, which increased the need for fuel. Such conditions intensified through the 1470s and 1480s, which correlates with expressed concerns over fuel provision in the historical record. What such conditions translated to in the lived experience of most Scots is not recorded, beyond the eye-catching comments of Walter Bower in his accounts of extreme winters in the 1430s. But from his well-supplied warm chamber, the abbot may have been unaware of the reality of peasants' experience of living through the extended winters and springs of the bitterly cold northerly winds that he reported. It is only in later centuries that we see the graphic illustrations of the problem of peat dependency in an era of wetter summers and colder winters. Quite simply, wet peat don't burn, and saturated peat loses its cohesion and disintegrates, making transportation and storage even more difficult. Poor cutting, drying and storing practices added to the difficulties, again as illustrated in the record from later centuries of the repeated efforts to regulate such things and prevent the physical degradation of mosses from which it was cut. It was not that peat was unobtainable. The problem was more of being able to cut, dry and store sufficient quantities for annual needs. Dependence does not mean that peat was used to the exclusion of all other fuels. Mixes are recorded in property grants in lowland areas. On the Erskine's estate in 1441, for example, a lease near Alloa included windfall wood rights in the forest of Clackmannan, plus peat and turf in the local moss. These three fuels had varying calorific values and thermal efficiency and may have been used in different contexts for different purposes. Turf, for example, the poorest thermal energy source, was used for keeping domestic hearths burning overnight or when intense heat and flame was not wanted, with wood used for fire starting and where quick heating at a higher calorific output was needed, peat providing the main thermal output for cooking and heating in most households. Charcoal was also available, but was reserved largely for technical usage, for example metalworking, where the highest temperatures were wanted. Archaeological evidence from Perth suggests just such selection of fuel types for different purposes between peat, turf, smallwood and charcoal. Even in the extensive zone of blanket peat coverage through the southern uplands, Highlands, Hebrides and Northern Isles, mixes of types were employed, including, again, dried seaweed and cattle or sheep dung. Although the bulk of ash deposits are from peat and turfs. The later 14th century house at Bornish in South Uist illustrates this diversity, with peat dominating hearth deposits but with wood, dung, cereal processing waste and other dried plant remains identified. The wood included a small amount from the limited patches of woodland that still existed in the Uists by that date, but most was burned fragments from wooden utensils or structural members that had reached the end of their recyclable potential, or dried heather that was cut and stored for fuel use. Even with such diversity of combustible materials, however, the worst years of the 15th century pushed many households to the uttermost margins of their capacity to secure the volumes necessary to subsist with any degree of comfort. What was that necessary volume for comfortable existence? Estimates in the 1950s that were between 15,000 and 18,000 peats were consumed annually by what Frank Fraser-Darling termed a crofting household, quote, not being very extravagant with fuel, end quote. Using the 18th century rule of thumb of an average of 200 loads, whatever that meant, 200 loads of peat to fuel a single domestic hearth, and with each load approximating 1 cubic metre, we can comprehend the level of inroad that 3 centuries of cutting and consumption would have had on the mosses around most urban communities. It is likely that long before 1400, the thousands of cubic metres cut annually from these mosses closest to the boroughs had seen those sources depleted, adding significantly to the time expended on travelling to and transporting fuel from increasingly distant peateries. Deteriorating weather as much as shortages locally stimulated a transition to coal in the Forth salt manufactories. It is likely that the shift in emphasis from the peat-burning sleeching sites on the karsts of the inner estuary to the coal-burning seawater boiling operations of the outer Firth accelerated after 1400, aided by a reduction in the supply of Biscay salt caused by poor conditions for solar evaporation on the Atlantic coast of Brittany and Gascony. Increased estate coal output to feed the salt pans produced surplus fuel that some merchants began to supply to energy-hungry burgesses. Thus, mines around Tranent and in South Fife were shipping some of their product to Edinburgh before 1400. It was this opportunism that saw the beginning of the slow shift in priorities for coal supply from salt pans to urban consumers, with the borough markets receiving the higher quality large coals and the salters receiving the smaller, less marketable pieces referred to as panwood. Edinburgh's richer burgesses were among the more fortunate, however, for communities located far from the coalfields faced an uphill struggle in identifying and securing access to new sources. Some indication of supply stress in Eastern Borders District, for example, is seen in the steady increase in records of access to new sources being sought by consumers and of disputes between property holders over boundaries in peat mosses. An illustration of the desperation for new supplies is provided by the grant of the bailiory and justiciary of Kelso Abbey's free barony jurisdiction made in 1478 by Abbot Robert Kerr to his kinsman Walter Kerr of Caverton for the latter's gift of rights to fuel in the moor of Caverton, 6 kilometres from Kelso. Kelso's records show that until then it had still been exploiting the dwindling resources granted to it in the 1120s on Ednam Moor. Those reserves were severely depleted before 1300, when the monks took legal measures to safeguard the remaining peat. Close to fuel-hungry Perth, records from 1483 of a conflict between Scone Abbey and Thomas Wardrop of Gothans over possession of a moss here at Arnbathy in the Sidlaw Hills northeast of the borough expose different agendas. Here, the basis of the dispute was a clash over the extent of ownership in a moss on the boundary between their respective properties, but the key issue was Wardrop's commercial interest in supplying its peat to fuel-starved Perth, and Scone wanting a cut. The slow violence of the steady erosion of fuel security quickened by circa 1525 into sporadic fast violence over adequate peat supplies. Records expose an emerging problem in the sub-Highland zone extending from central Perthshire through Angus and Lowland Aberdeenshire to the country between Banff and Inverness. One early surviving record of conflict concerns the moors here between Arbroath and Brechin, where a lawsuit between Lord Ogilvie and Lady Lovett in 1539 record him disputing the rights of her tenants to cut peat on the moor of Montreathment, and her complaining of his tenants' physical assaults on her people who were seeking to exercise their claimed rights in the moor. This clash can be read simply as a dispute over economic and jurisdictional rights, but deep anxiety over securing exclusive possession of a diminishing resource lurks behind it. Unsurprisingly, such conflicts cluster in periods of heightened anxiety at times of extreme climatic instability. In 1692, in the depths of the Seven Ill Years, the Angus laird James Ogilvy of Cluny accused 17 of his kinsmen and neighbours of attempting to drive him from the mosses of Poole and Fernocht in Glen Isla. The complaint detailed a violent attack as part of a wider local dispute over property issues, and it's detailed here. But tension over fuel rights flared in the extreme winters, delayed springs, cool summers and early autumns, all with increased precipitation and colder temperatures, which occurred from the later 1680s. Such conditions caused severe problems for provision of fuel, and accounts suggest that some mosses were heavily eroded or rendered unworkable by waterlogging. James Ogilvy had been awarded exclusive rights there by his superiors, the Earl of Airlie, thereby ensuring that he and his tenants had a secure fuel supply. His success, however, meant exclusion for other Ogilvy tenants, including his attackers, who felt aggrieved by what previously had been a common resource being given into the hands of one man. Much more evidence for conflict over access to fuel during the Little Ice Age lies in the records of the royal boroughs, whose exclusive rights in their common land faced mounting challenge from tenants of neighbouring rural communities whose supplies were dwindling. I will now focus on just one example of such pressures, Elgin in Moray. Elgin is an inland community lying in a lowland district subject to intense agricultural development since prehistory. Woodland survived here in a few seigneurial hunting forests, and the borough's common supply of peat was, by circa 1250, the only significant local fuel source. Elgin's response to encroachment on its mosses are preserved in its extensive council records. These chart a course from a laissez-faire attitude born of earlier medieval belief in a cornucopia of fuel in its hands to rigorous regulation and active intervention to prolong the exploitable life of a dwindling resource. They also present us with a classic illustration of another manifestation of the slow violence model, the progressive transition from a good held and enjoyed in common by the community through regulation and intrusive oversight of the community's use of that good by the governing oligarchy of the borough council, to the council's eventual privatisation of the resource for commercial supply of a now marketised commodity. Down to the 1540s, there is little explicit evidence for problems. From then, however, there was regular council action to assert the town's monopoly rights in nearby mossland. Eventually, in December 1549, damage caused by unregulated cutting by individuals with no rights in the borough's land saw the council enact protective legislation. This stipulated that no one was to go to the moss with creels to cut or carry peat unless accompanied by a council officer, and to carry the peat away on horseback. Anyone caught doing so unaccompanied was to be put in the stocks for 24 hours. Access to the moss was restricted to burgesses only, but even they had to work under supervision. This initial act failed as a deterrent and was strengthened in 1551 when it was ordained that violators found carrying away peat in creels would forfeit their creel, peat and outer clothing, a 5-shilling fine and a day's imprisonment. Nighttime removal of peat was forbidden under threat of banishment, a provision which suggests surreptitious cutting under cover of darkness. Unregulated, unsupervised and petty encroachment were the main issues, but the later 1500s saw more radical measures introduced to deal with townsfolk abusing their rights. In 1580, the council divided the moss into blocks and leased it out. The aim was that the lessees would manage the moss and carry peat to Elgin to sell to fellow burgesses. There was hostility to this privatisation of the communal resource, and restriction on use had to be reissued in 1581, this time targeting both full burgesses and the so-called unfree townsmen who had no rights in common resources. The borough court ordained that no one was to, quote, cut fail, that's the top grass layer of turf, fuel or divot in the moss, or howk, dig out, or flay, take off the grass layer, literally to flay the ground, in any way, under the threat of a 40 shillings fine. That the council had to extend its restrictions to legitimate as well as unlicensed users of the moss and raise the level of fine 8-fold indicates the failure of previous measures. The 1581 ordinance also reveals that inroads into the moss were not caused solely by those seeking fuel, but also by those taking materials for dykes and roofing. The Act reveals a further concern that removal of turf to deepen cultivated ground was exposing the underlying peat to weather erosion, further depleting the reserves. This regulation of access by leasing cutting rights to a few tenants and limiting use of the moss had some effect, with no further evidence for council action recorded until 1638, when it enacted that no burgess should cast peats without a warrant. Strict limits on quantities cut were also imposed, as were measures to ensure that cutting and clearing was such as to preserve moss integrity. Alongside regulation of legitimate use, the council also prosecuted folk from neighbouring parishes who took fuel illicitly from borough land. Despite such action, fuel shortage outside the town's mosses was sufficiently pressing for men from adjacent areas to risk arrest, fines and imprisonment to secure peat for their domestic needs. Such encroachment led in 1652 to fresh action against unlicensed cutting. This act also reveals the dearth of fuel in adjoining parishes and opportunist action by burgesses to benefit commercially from that shortage. None of the moss tenants was permitted to sell fuel to anyone except Elgin folk or face a £10 fine and imprisonment at the will of the borough court. As with earlier acts, however, necessity drove country folk to ignore it and continue to cut peat regardless of the consequences. Despite these regulations, mosses around Elgin continued to suffer misuse. South of the town, the moss was described in 1656 as spoiled by overcutting, the suspicion being that burgesses were taking more than for their own use and selling the surplus. 30 years later, as weather slid towards the cold, wet condition of the 7 ill years, the council fined all those licensed to work the mosses west of Elgin for exceeding quotas and selling peat to non-townsmen. Profit made from supplying fuel to neighbouring districts evidently outweighed the risks of detection. The poor state of the mosses closest to Elgin may account for mounting concerns in the 1670s to secure rights over more distant areas, the whole council visiting outlying sites to seize peat cut by unlicensed men. Actions of this kind became progressively more radical in response to the escalation of unlicensed cutting. In 1680, the council instructed all townsfolk who possessed horses and carts to come in their company to carry away any dry peat that had been cut illicitly and to throw any wet peats back into the cuttings. It was not, however, simply rural communities with whom the boroughs clashed. Neighbouring lairds whose tenants were drifting away as their traditional reserves failed resorted to conflict as often as negotiation to secure access to Elgin's mosses. The councillors were not completely inflexible, and as early as the 1640s had made concessions to influential neighbours. Between 1642 and 1655, Sir Robert Gordon of Gordonston made successive petitions which indicate that mosses on his lands were exhausted. At first, he obtained permission for his tenants. To cut unlimited fuel in the borough's moss for 1 year, but this was subsequently limited to 200 loads of peat per tenant, the quantity reckoned necessary to fuel a single hearth per annum, before being lowered again to only 100 loads, half the amount required per tenant, in 1655. But negotiation did not bring permanent resolution of the conflict, as underlying issues of supply of accessible fuels for both townsfolk and their landward neighbours could not be addressed without viable alternatives. A proliferation of lawsuits with their neighbours followed, a visit to the mosses by council delegation in 1686, which found that existing agreements had been broken. The borough responded with steps to police its lands and rights, and in the early 1690s, as the dire conditions of the 7 ill years bit, appointed an overseer of the mosses to ensure that all cutters had licences. But even this step failed to curtail illegal cutting, which continued through the first half of the 1700s. We have seen a close correlation between this upsurge in conflict over control of peat supplies at the close of the 17th century and the episode of extreme climatic disturbance in 1692-9 known as the 7 ill years. As we saw with James Ogilvie, throughout northern Scotland, dispute over boundaries between holders of cutting rights flared into violent confrontation on the mosses. The slow violence of environmental degradation and resource depletion had boiled over into the fast manifestations of legitimate and illegitimate violence. But not everywhere, for the same period also saw moves to better manage remaining resources. At Elgin, efforts in 1693 to improve the quality of the moss described as spoiled in the 1650s, and so extend the workable area through improved drainage, exposes the impact of waterlogging by increased rainfall. Drainage, however, brought only a temporary respite as concerns over adequacy of supply resurfaced in the 1700s. The main indication of Elgin's difficulties escalating after circa 1700 are in council attempts to control the price of peat charged by those with cutting licences. The absence of alternatives, coupled with growing demand, gave licence suppliers a monopoly which they turned to private advantage. In 1729, it was reported that the peat dealers' action was extortionate, and pairs of councillors were ordered to visit the peat market daily to ensure that only agreed prices were charged. Efforts to subvert that ordinance through forestalling forced the council to threaten legal action against any burgess buying fuel other than in the marketplace. They recognised, however, that forestalling stemmed from local peat dearth. This shortage triggered a fresh round of attempts to enforce the borough's exclusive rights through the 1730s and 1740s, which saw mounting hostility to such efforts from their neighbours. As pressure on fuel reserves intensified after 1750, lawsuits proliferated. Paradoxically, although it was recognised that the most accessible peat sources were almost exhausted, the mid-18th century saw accelerating losses there. In July 1749, when the council met to inspect the moss, as well as the expected illicit cutting, they discovered a new threat. Some of the moss was being cultivated. In 1749, the inroads were small, but they were major concern by 1752, and a succession of actions against non-burgesses attempted to end further damage. This new use was part of a growing trend nationally. As early as 1725 at Whithorn, council attempts to meet their statutory duty to give the parish minister a suitable supply of peat had been thwarted by a local laird's refusal to yield former common mossland which he had converted into profitable pasture. It was, he said, made valuable property through his cost and effort, and the land should not be, quote, condemned to be used as a moss forever, end quote. In his eyes, his return from the new pasture vastly outstripped its value as a fuel reserve. His further work on converting the moss into profit-yielding land was claimed in 1763 to have hastened the exhaustion of the minister's source awarded him in 1725, but an investigation by the council exonerated him of that charge. Nevertheless, around Whithorn, as at Elgin, the conversion of moss into agricultural land accelerated the pace of depletion and added another dimension to the problem. At Elgin, meanwhile, in 1752, a salaried overseer and mossgrieve was appointed to halt abuse. While his efforts were successful at first, the system broke down within a decade. A court action in September 1762 charged 27 men for cutting and selling peat from the moss. Some confessed to removing peat and turf to mix with material from their dunghills to make richer soil for crops. The principal concern, however, was that the area of moss being broken into actual cultivation. 2 years later, 19 men faced similar charges and were fined and imprisoned for destroying the moss, building houses on it, enclosing parts of it, and planting potatoes and other roots and vegetables in it. Despite the new enthusiasm for agricultural improvement that we'll look at tomorrow, which was sweeping the country, with fuel supply still under pressure, the borough could not accept erosion of its resources for agricultural intakes unless viable alternative fuels could be found. Consequently, in June 1767, the council began litigation over disputed rights in the moor south-east of the borough. In February 1768, they also reasserted a reservation first voiced in 1638 of outlying mosses for the borough's exclusive use. The aim in both actions was to get a judgment to enable them to pursue lawsuits to expel encroachers and halt the spread of cultivation. Their difficulty was that the only alternative was to persuade neighbours to sell their equally precious peat in the borough. Improvement of the road network meant that more distant peat sources could now be reached. but travelling times to them entailed a consequent loss of labour for other activities, effectively driving up prices. Recognition of the townsmen's dependence meant that rural suppliers could milk them for profit, despite council efforts to fix prices at reasonable levels. In 1774, however, a possible solution emerged when the council finally bought 50 tons of English coal for sale to burgesses, since continuous rain had prevented peat drying and made it likely that it would be in short supply and at higher cost. Concurrently with that purchase, neighbouring lords like the Duke of Gordon and Earl of Seafield were intensifying prospection efforts on their estates to find previously unrecognised coal measures, believing that only easy access to that fuel would resolve both the long-running issues of peat exhaustion and their quest for energy to drive forward regional economic development. Elgin's action indicates that the development of coastal trade offered alternative solutions to local shortages. Coal, however, was burdened by a heavy government transport duty, rendering it an expensive commodity in northern Scotland. Low-income households still had to find what fuel they could in the dwindling mosses. Even when the coal duty was abolished in 1793, there was no overnight transformation, but fuel supply in northern Scotland gradually improved as coal became more widely affordable. It is wrong, however, to think that by the early 1800s, conflict over access to mosses around Elgin had ended, for those on the economic margins still needed to supplement coal purchases from the mosses for decades to come. 2.5 centuries is a protracted period to be spanned by a single crisis, but it is too easy to dismiss the actions and claims of town councils like Elgin since the 1540s as panicked responses provoked by a perception of incipient crisis not borne out by on-the-ground realities. It is also not simply a case of boroughs enforcing monopolies over local supplies in regions where no alternatives were available. For records of disputes between great and small landowners and their tenants, often spilling over into violence, indicate that throughout the more densely populated districts of northeastern Scotland, peat was an increasingly precious commodity from the early 1500s onwards. The shift from a situation where peat was considered an abundant, inexhaustible resource held in common and exploited by all to the full satisfaction of their needs through restriction on access to the moss and volumes extracted by individuals, to managed cutting by licensed peat dealers, marked a steady deterioration in the condition and extent of the remaining mosses. Interventionist management of mosses by borough councils was widely resented by some who once enjoyed unrestricted access, but the policy succeeded in maintaining supply, albeit at progressively rising cost. Although we still see the supply issue in primarily economic terms, and precarity of dependable supplies of thermal energy did impair the economic development of northern Scotland's boroughs, we need also to recognise better the narrative of sustained environmental degradation that our records of the peat crisis present. Anthropogenic action, the centuries of unregulated exploitation of apparently inexhaustible bounty, had undoubted agency in preparing the figurative landscape of this situation. But the correlation of the rising clamour for remedy and of rising violence, licit and illicit, to provide one, with the deepening climatic cooling and wettening of the Little Ice Age, underscores the catalysing of human and environmental factors in delivering crisis. And there is a coda to the saga of human resource consumption. What had changed was that those whose economic interests had been satisfied by the lifting of the duty on coal were no longer interested in peat, as the final privatisation and disposal of borough common peat mosses in the following decades, or its stripping and dumping in extensive land improvement schemes evidence. For those on the economic margins, however, and especially those living remote from railheads and ports, coal was not an option. Despite a perception of the end of large-scale inroads into the mosses for fuel at the end of the 18th century, peat continued to be the main source of thermal energy for rural dwellers in such places into the second half of the 20th century. Its extraction over 3.5 millennia represents a landscape transformation and carbon release on a scale greater than all our forest loss, but whose impact is barely acknowledged in popular environmental discourse. Thank you.